Born in the hot Georgia summer of 1899, the son of a Baptist minister and a piano teacher, Thomas Andrew Dorsey learned early to play the blues. He moved north to study music in Chicago, where he would live his long musical life of 93 years. He's credited for hundreds of blues songs, but perhaps most famous for his gospel music, and especially the hymn he wrote in 1932. It's number 628 in the hymnals that we use in our worship when we're together in person. After his first wife and son died as the result of complications during childbirth, in the depths of that valley of the shadow of death, in the grips of grief, Dorsey, like the psalmist, sang of his trust in the Lord of life. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Unimaginable grief has inspired many of the deepest confessions of faith throughout the ages. And grief has led some of the strongest rejections of faith as well. What moves a person whose world has been rocked by a deep loss to compose such comforting and beautiful words in the face of death? How do we stand through the storm when we can't find our way through the dark, when we are tired, weak, and worn? The psalmist says we are able to live in the shadows of grief because God is with us. Even there, facing death, loss, and heartache. We are able because God gives us all we need. Like a shepherd, leading us to green pastures and safely beside the still waters, where we find restoration for our very souls. The poetry is all too familiar to those of us in the church. Perhaps the most quoted chapter in the Bible. It is comforting the moment we hear the first 5 words, for we know what follows. A pledge of trust in the goodness and mercy of God, whose promise we can rely on. God's promise to be present in the midst of the danger and suffering, even the death we know as human residents of this earth. That promise is true and trustworthy. Fred Rogers of the famous Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood television show once told a friend facing the impending death of his father that death is human. And anything human is worth mentioning. And anything worth mentioning is manageable. Anything worth mentioning is manageable. God does not promise life without grief, without loss, without pain or suffering. Not even if you follow all the commandments and give your life completely to God. No one is spared tragedy, pain, or loss. It is part of this world. And while God knows that we will experience all of it, God promises to not abandon us in our suffering. God is not the author of our suffering. Suffering is not the will nor the hope of God for humanity. Rabbi Harold Kushner has authored several books on this subject, including Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, and one on the 23rd Psalm. He was interviewed several years ago about his book on the 23rd Psalm. Rabbi Kushner said, God's promise was never that life would be fair. God's promise was, when it's your turn to confront the unfairness of life, no matter how hard it is, you'll be able to handle it because he'll be on your side. He will give you the strength you need to find your way through. The rabbi continued, I was paraphrasing the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The psalmist is not saying I will fear no evil because evil only happens to people who deserve it. The rabbi said, he's saying this is a scary, out-of-control world, but it doesn't scare me because I know that God is on my side, not on the side of the hijacker. God is on my side, not on the side of the illness or the accident or the terrible thing that happened. And that's enough to give me the confidence. He said the 23rd Psalm is the answer to the question, how do you live in a dangerous, unpredictable, frightening world? He said some things happen in the world that God does not want to happen. God is good. Nature is not always good. Nature is blind. Nature is amoral. Fire burns, and bullets wound, and falling rocks injure, and disease germs infect everybody, whether you deserve it or not. Rabbi Kushner was inspired to write all of his books by the death of his son, who was 14 years old and was born with an incurable illness. He said, I asked myself, how did my wife and I get through that? You would think that would shatter the faith of the average person. Where did we find the strength and the ability to raise him, to comfort him when he was sick and scared? And ultimately, to lose him. And he said the only answer is when we used up all of our own strength and love and faith, there really is a God. And he replenishes your love and your strength and your faith. But he said people who have been hurt by life get stuck, often in the valley of the shadow, and they don't know how to find their way out. And that's the role of God. The role of God is not to explain and not to justify, but to comfort, he said, to find people when they are living in darkness, take them by the hand and show them how to find their way into the sunlight again. He said, why do people let themselves get stuck? Sometimes, I think, he said, they feel guilty that they're still alive and somebody they love has died. Sometimes, he said, I suspect they're afraid. They're afraid if they ever permitted themselves to recover, then they would lose the person not only physically but emotionally as well. And as a rabbi, he said, I would try to explain to them, no, that's not how it works. When you have loved somebody, they have entered so intimately into the fabric of your soul that neither death nor time can ever take them out. They are always with you. Friends, grief is hard work. The pain of losing a loved one is like no other. And the healing process is unique as well. Grief is a journey through the valley of the shadows. No real shortcuts to recovery, just step by step and day by day. Many of us work hard to avoid the pain we bear, the sorrow or hurt, the sadness of loss. 5 years ago, Disney Pixar released the hit movie Inside Out, which told the story of 11-year-old Riley, whose family moved from Minnesota to California. We, the viewer, get to see 5 of her emotions building up or tearing down her memories. Riley is overwhelmed by the loss of everything familiar. Has a hard time expressing her true sadness because she wants to please her parents. One of the emotions we meet is joy, the eternal optimist, a 7 on the Enneagram, if you've ever explored it. Always trying to make happy memories by repressing anything negative or sad. The other emotion, sadness, says, crying helps me slow down and obsess over the weight of life's problems. In other words, to help Riley be present in her grief and true to her deepest hurts. It's in that valley of shadows, while surrounded by the unconditional love of her mom and dad, Riley is truly able to find joy again. When we know and feel the true love of God wrapping us in an unconditional embrace, we too may find hope and joy and peace, even in the midst of a pandemic. While no one loss compares to another, the more intimate we are, close we are to the one we lose, the deeper the valley of grief may seem. And grief may be complicated if we are stuck in the valley of multiple losses, making the journey more difficult still. This Sunday marks the 5th anniversary of my mother's death, just 8 weeks after my father's death back in 2015. And this Tuesday will be the 20th anniversary of my father-in-law's death, all of whom we miss and about whom we will always share good memories and stories. Even after 20 years, we've not lost our good memories of Terry's dad, and I expect we never will. So we have moved through the valley of shadows, confident in God's presence in and around us through the kindness, compassion, generosity, mercy, and goodness shared with us by people of faith, just like you. Grief is real for everyone, and every one of us will express our grief in our own ways. Our journey through the valley of shadows will be at our own pace, and God promises to walk through the valley with us. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forevermore. This is the good news of faith. As disciples of the resurrected Jesus, that yea, though we walk through the shadows of death, of loss, of pain, of suffering, of despair, we do not journey alone. God's goodness and mercy go with us all the way. All the way. In Jesus, God incarnate, God in our vulnerable human flesh, God journeyed through the same old valley, knows our step by step and day by day, our hurts and our hopes, and through the gift of loving one another, reaches out hands of compassion and healing, taking our hand to lead us on, to lead us home.